think by having been elected to the House of Commons by the voters in his constituency and having been nominated by the Prime Minister to become Minister of Justice, or at least initially as Parliamentary Secretary, I think that was his get out of jail free card. And so there was nothing that the RCMP could do at that point to restrict Trudeau's access to the government documents. I think they let the documents roam freely at that point. There's nothing that they could do.
It's over here.
You spent some time on Trudeau's left-wing affinities, but some years ago I watched a report on 60 Minutes on, say, some individuals who left Eastern Europe in about 1945-46, who weren't left-wing at all, but nonetheless may have been war criminals. There's some evidence that the Trudeau government certainly protected these people and may have tried to cover up for them. Did you think this is a failing of his? Well, it obviously is.
Yes, I think it's a profound failing. And it was an issue that came up during his time in government. When pressed, and it's not just on this issue, but when pressed by the opposition to pass laws that would enable the Canadian government to pursue, investigate, pursue, apprehend, and deport war criminals based on evidence, not just on a whim, but based on evidence. Trudeau rejected those ideas. In fact, not only did he reject the idea, he went on to say that, well, there's crimes committed in war by all sides, and that we're as guilty of war crimes, in effect, as are other nations. Now, this is a man who represents a constituency in Montreal that was predominantly Jewish. Many Holocaust survivors. But he refused to have anything to do with the prosecution of crimes that were committed in other countries. He did not want sort of what he called sort of revision of history. But these were people who committed crimes, who were allowed entry into Canada, largely on false pretenses. And ultimately, it was the Mulroney government that called the Shane Commission into war crimes, and that led to legislation that allowed the Canadian government to pursue war criminals and deport war criminals. And as part of the research for that book, they looked at Trudeau's conduct while Prime Minister, and they found direct evidence of his personal interventions against pursuing war criminals who live in Canada. It's in the chapter in the book called No Apologies, if you want to get a short time to it. Because I also talk about his conduct during World War II, which, parading around Quebec on a motorcycle wearing a German military uniform, trying to scare the hell out of people, and preaching sedition within political circles in Quebec at the time. He claimed to have kind of ignored the war, but the reality is quite different.
He never compared motorcycle notes with Shea, did he?
I'm sure Che Guevara would have been a hero of his, as was Fidel. But this was a sad chapter, and in that regard, he refused to address the issue of Canadians of Japanese origin who were interned during the Second World War, who were looking for an apology, who were looking for some justice for the treatment that they had been subjected to. And Trudeau said, it's not up to me to repair the damages of the past. This is ancient history. Some of the people who were interned were younger than Pierre Trudeau, who were still living. They were living in Canada, paying taxes in Canada. They were born in Canada. And he was telling them that it wasn't up to him to redress problems of the past. But he was in a position to deal with war criminals, and he refused to do so.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I'll just make a quick comment, and that's not what I want you to reply to, but I'll never agree that official bilingualism has done anything good to Canada. That's just my comment. Okay. Further to that, can you, and I'm not sure if it's in your book, but was there any mention about how women of the day lost their heads because they were so in love with Trudeau? Did that affect how he was always being voted in, or how they, that whole Trudeau-mania thing worked in his favor? Like, was that addressed in your book at all?
You know, very indirectly, because again, the book is about what he did as Prime Minister and not about the man. But I do talk about Trudeau-mania. I do talk about voting patterns, and you know, obviously, you know, he did very well with women voters. For whatever reason. I don't talk about his love life, except only to the extent that of this, that the Clyde Wells, who was the Premier of Newfoundland, who ultimately dealt the fatal blow to the Meech Lake Constitutional Court, advising him on the Constitution was Deborah Coyne. Now, Deborah Coyne, who recently ran for leader, had a trial with Pierre Trudeau. And so, you know, this was, you know, he was pretty close to 70 years of age. He picked her out of a line at law school. He was Prime Minister. It was around 1980, and she was in law school as a student. And caught each other's eye, I guess. And so he invited her as a special guest of his for the constitutional conferences. That's what they call it. But beyond you know, his magnetism and appeal, I really don't go into that in any great detail.
And the other stupid thing he did was that metric system.
Okay, I do go into the metric system. You know, and the money that it cost. The metric system would have made absolutely perfect sense for Canada had we been following the United States. But where was the metric system in place? The metric system was in place in socialist countries around the world, communist countries around the world. This is where Trudeau traveled. This was, you know, he was a citizen of the world. And so this was one more way to thumb his nose at the Americans. Well, we're going to go metric. We're going to prove that we're better than you. Well, it just caused enormous heartache and grief and cost and confusion. And it was ultimately left to the Mulroney government to change the law so it wasn't a crime for you to be able to measure your hamburger in pounds and measure your kids in inches. It's no longer a crime. So some things we do in metric we get used to, and other things we don't. But I mean, there's examples like that. What about, you know, Mirabel Airport? Mirabel Airport cost the equivalent of $6 billion to build it today. The massive amount of farmland. He didn't like farmers. He said farmers are nothing but a bunch of complainants. And he said, you know, we're going to build this great airport, and we're going to have Toronto, this is Prime Minister of Canada, saying we're going to have Toronto down on their knees because of what we're going to do for Mirabel. Which kind of reminds me of what Justin's saying about, you know, pitting one region against another. We're going to do this great thing, Mirabel Airport. And it didn't work out so well. In fact, he decided to scrap Mirabel Airport as the primary passenger airport for Montreal after one of his cabinet ministers told him that the return cab fare from downtown Montreal to Mirabel and back, was $100. Pierre Trudeau was a notorious cheapskate, at least with his own money, not with taxpayers. And he said, my word, you know, we can't have that. And so he tried to kill the Dorval Airport. Didn't work. And it isn't ironic that the Liberals now named the Dorval Airport Pierre Elliott Trudeau International.
Last question.
Okay, this whole thing is going contrary to the official narrative. You know, as conservatives, we're always the skunk at the party, you know, because, you know, they'll tell some glowing story about Pierre Trudeau and he's charming and yada, and then you come out with facts about the deficit. And is there a nice way to do it? Is there a way to do it that isn't just telling the voters and Santa Claus? You know, I mean, we've had some practice at it now, and I'm just wondering if there's any kind of way to soften the blow or make it more, because honestly, I think we've all experienced this, that there's the narrative, and if you get do anything that's not the narrative, they look at you like you don't believe in gravity. So that's sort of, if there's a question in there, I don't know.
Well, you know, it's interesting you start your question about, you know, there is no Santa Claus in this, because that was a campaign line that Pierre Trudeau used in 1968. When people were concerned about, should we really be trusting this guy, this untested intellectual, millionaire, academic, flamboyant guy with our economy and with our nation? And he said, hey, listen, you know, the government's no Santa Claus. You know, government has to live within its means. That's the kind of thing people say before they get elected. But of course, he did want to be Santa Claus, you know, ultimately. But you know, I think he's Santa Claus who pays his debts. Now, you're asking if there's an easy way to sort of soften the blow to bring people on side. In my judgment, having been part of the narrative on the other side for a couple of years now, there is no easy way to do it. I think you have to hit it head on. I have to say with conviction, not only, it stuns people when you say, not only was he not Canada's best Prime Minister, he is Canada's worst Prime Minister. I say, well, point him and say, how can you possibly say that? And you say, did he help the economy, or did he hurt the economy? Was he good or bad? And you only need 3 or 4 points of reference: the declining dollar, the rising deficit, the high unemployment. Take your pick of any economic measure. They're terrible. National leader, did the country really come together and embrace itself under Trudeau? Was unity there? Not really. And if they say, well, but he was great on the world stage, and you can say, well, I guess you and Fidel Castro have something in common. Jimmy Carter did go to Pierre Trudeau's funeral. So, you know, I think, hopefully if this book captures any kind of interest across the country, it's not just this book, but there's guys like David Brum who have been writing about Pierre Trudeau. It's like when there's a bully out there and no one is prepared even to confront them, and they just hold this omniscient